And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Mr. John Toole. Mr. Toole currently serves as the Executive Director of the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, which focuses on practice and policy reform through an active commitment to partnerships with state, local, and federal agencies that are dedicated to improving the lives of our nation's youth. He has a bachelor's degree in social work from James Madison University and a Master of Arts degree in criminal justice from George Washington University. Mr. Toole has devoted his entire professional career to practice within and reform on behalf of the juvenile justice and related youth serving systems. Prior to his work with the RFK Center for Juvenile Justice, Mr. Toole worked with the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court in Fairfax County, Virginia, where he was a probation officer, intake officer, and residential group care administrator for a 22-bed residential facility for chronically delinquent boys, covering the period from 1979 to 1996. He then served with the U.S. Department of Justice with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and then went on to work with the Child Welfare League of America, where he directed the newly created Juvenile Justice Division. Mr. Toole began working with the Robert F. Kennedy Community Alliance in 2009, where he founded and launched the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice in 2013. He has authored several publications on the topics of probation and youth justice system reform, dual status youth, and diversion that provides frameworks for state and local jurisdictions to achieve positive outcomes. Mr. Toole is also the proud father of 2 adult sons. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Toole. Thank you for being here.
Michelle, thank you so much. A very kind introduction. I think I'm at a point where I recognize that introduction merely convinces everyone that I'm old. My sons try to convince me to just say, no, Dad, just say older. And the reality is I've had a long and joyous experience in the youth justice system. I'm appreciative of the opportunity you're providing me here today. And I welcome any questions, any interaction that we can have during the session. And that means if you have questions, speak up. I can easily be interrupted, so we can make this a more interactive format during the time we have together. So again, thank you. Thank Brianne for the support in getting to this place. Welcome, everyone. I come to you this morning from a project assignment in San Diego, California. Obviously, I know in my home state of North Carolina, it's the afternoon, but I'm on a different time zone at this point. Looking forward to sharing some information, some perspectives, and maybe hearing your thoughts about this very important topic of dual status youth. So Michelle has accurately provided that I'm the executive director for the National Resource Center. Our mission, as we launched 10 years ago, was really to provide expert technical assistance and consultation to state and local jurisdictions across the country on behalf of youth justice system improvement. My experience that Michelle spoke about reflects that I have worked with several dual status youth in my career. And unfortunately, some of the outcomes for those youth were rather tragic. And it really had a significant impact on my efforts when I created the center to support this cross-system collaboration and multi-system work that leads to better outcomes for this very challenging and vulnerable population. We are strongly committed to the adolescent development science, the best practice and research-driven approaches, and evidence-based or data-driven treatment and services that we provide for these youth. And as you'll learn very shortly, we are also deeply committed to the collaborative approach that is so critically important to success to achieve the possible on behalf of dual status youth in our local courts and in our local youth justice systems. This slide merely captures a little bit about us. That are 5 key principles driving our work. We are strongly supportive of the science that has emerged in the last 25 years, supporting risk and needs assessments to help guide and structure our professional judgment for treatment and services. As you've heard, we're committed to the evidence base of programs and services that we know gives us a greater likelihood of achieving success on behalf of these youth when we connect these services to those youth and their families. I mentioned cross-system and collaborative approach. We'll get into a little bit of detail about that being more than just a concept, but an actual practice that's driven by research to ensure success for this multi-system population of youth. Unfortunately, the data continues to reflect over the past 20 years that among this dual status population, as we go deeper into their trajectories within each system, we find greater overrepresentation of youth of color, and often find disparate practices contributing to that penetration by the youth of color among this population. And what will really make you jump out of your chair as I speak to you today, I know it wakes you up with great enthusiasm, is that we're strongly committed to implementation science and change management. There's some core principles about infrastructure development, cross-system collaboration, true development of detailed policies, procedures, and protocols that are critical to the long-term success of dual status youth and our work in our local jurisdictions to create the collaboration that allows us to realize that success for these youth. We do highlight what has emerged in the last 20 years, and that's the adolescent brain science. We think it's fundamental, particularly to this population, that we understand what that adolescent brain science tells us. And this is a way oversimplification of 3 bullets that emerged from the National Research Council's report 10 years ago that acknowledged the impact of brain science and adolescent development on the behavior of those youth who are described as adolescents. I do want to qualify for everyone. When I speak to adolescents, there's no pure science on that definition. It's often recognized as age 10 to 17, but the brain science that's referenced in this brief that we wrote in 2017 recognizes that the adolescent's development really starts to occur at age 6 and matures likely around age 24 to 26. That's what we're referencing here. So you see it's loosely described as adolescent development, and particularly for courts' interest, where we have jurisdiction of young people, it's only part of the picture in the brain science that allows us to draw the conclusions that the Supreme Court drew in these 3 sub-bullets. Less capacity for self-regulation in adolescents, heightened sensitivity to peer pressure, and less ability to contemplate future orientation or consequences for our current actions in the way we act. Now, those of us who have children recognize that this is common sense, but application in the youth justice system, particularly for these dual status youth, is critically important to understand. And for any legal backgrounds that are participating in today's session, I don't want to lose you. This is not a discussion, and the Supreme Court contemplates that it's not a discussion about the absence of responsibility or culpability. It's about the recognition that during this period, there's a diminished ability to consider consequences for those actions. And some influences are greater for adolescents than they are for us as adults. At least those of us among us that mature into adulthood with an adequate understanding of responsibility and accountability. So what we're gonna discuss today is multidisciplinary system best practice alignment. And this bulleted points capture some of the key features of adolescent development, of positive youth development, the malleability of adolescents to change their pattern of behavior is greater than at any other point in our lifetimes. So there is a rich understanding with adolescent development that positive influences, as the research would suggest, is more incentivizing to change the behavior, are maximized during this period. And I think that gives us hope to change a pattern of behavior. But we also have to address trauma, which is significant in the population of youth who enter both the child welfare and the youth justice, the juvenile justice system. But it's exponentially multiplied by those that are involved in both systems. And with active trauma symptoms at the time that we encounter them, unless we address those with evaluation and with proper intervention treatment services, we're unlikely for any case plan to be effective with those youth. So these are bullets that capture, we really need to carry a collaborative understanding of adolescent development, positive youth development, the impact of trauma, which can change and alter the way the brain reacts to certain circumstances that are external. And for these youth, there are multiple traumas that have occurred in their life, according to the research. And then the notion of different decision points, there are opportunities for diversion for these youth from the formal prosecution and formal involvement in the youth justice system. Because once these youth enter, their trajectory is often deeper, more rapid, more repetitive, and often moving on into adulthood, unlike most youth who enter the youth justice system, whose behavior desists or abates, that keeps them involved in the youth justice system. So this is a picture to try to identify what has emerged as most important in our 20 years of work on behalf of this target population across the United States. We use these two documents to drive our work. The first is a guidebook that really maximizes the understanding of the research, the prevalence, the characteristics, and the practices that are characteristic of the dual status youth population. And then a technical assistance workbook that frames a set of activities that allows every disciplinary participation to understand this is what we're going to be doing at this step, at this point. This is what's required of us to do collaboratively. These are the policies and the procedures and the protocols that need to be developed. This is the framework that we've used to successfully achieve positive outcomes for dual status youth. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say anyone on the call today, I guarantee you have recognized this population and the challenges this population of youth and their families or caregivers face. And you can probably account for at least one of those youth in your experience who has had a rather tragic outcome, if not the depth of penetration into the adult criminal justice system for a lifetime of incarceration. Not unlike the 2 or 3 youth that I constantly refer to, but 3 in total with whom I worked that were dual status, that took their own life. I'm not trying to frame this as scare anybody into action, but the mere prevalence of this population should concern us, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the trajectory for these youth is often the one we're most fearful of for those of us committed to this line of work. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that what we've produced in our work with jurisdictions, both state and local, are measurable, sustainable, and positive results on behalf of this target population. And we always welcome the opportunity to discuss this further with anyone who recognizes the challenges and vulnerabilities of this population. Since we've just met, I'd like to offer some credibility to my statements. And this is a map that seeks to achieve that and recognize that we've worked all across the country, multiple jurisdictions, as far as Alaska. And quite honestly, because of our work in the territory of Guam, which is ongoing now, we've done some work around dual status youth for them as well. So I'll move on from this. This is what allows me to say to you the framework, the technical assistance process, the methods, the operational activities when we work with the jurisdiction intensively has expanded across these jurisdictions, and indeed they report the success from engaging in this work for the population. A quick primer. The fact is that these youth are at increased risk as a juvenile and as an adult. And there's virtually 25, 30 years of research that confirms that. The prevalence, as you see here, we did some work in King County about a decade ago and published a study, which is actually the gray cover on the left, on the bottom. But 2/3 of their youth justice population had prior history in the child welfare system. And as many as 30% of them, 29, had active involvement, dual involvement in the juvenile justice and child welfare system while we were working with them. And unfortunately, that's a pattern of replication in most of the jurisdictions in which we work, finding that kind of prevalence. And then once we learn about the impact of that prior history, according to research, it virtually becomes imperative for us to coordinate across child welfare, juvenile justice, with our attorneys and with the court and the bench to ensure a methodology and a process and a procedure that will enable us to achieve better success for these youth. Because some of the outcomes are those which we most care about avoiding, and they're captured in those 4 bullets at the bottom. Definitions. I think it's important to be clear. Our experience has helped us in any jurisdiction. If you're leading such an effort, those of you who are on the call today, we really need to be clear about who we're talking about. And that requires a data scan across both the child welfare and the juvenile justice system. Often the court can provide us some of this information. So whatever the source, we need to understand the prevalence of that population in our jurisdiction. I cited the research, but you'll be clear when we finish today. We do not impose a model. We have explored and developed what we want to call a framework that can lead to solutions that are unique and innovative in that local jurisdiction. So that local jurisdiction doesn't need to rely on what the research says about Seattle. We need to rely on prevalence, characteristics, current policies, statutory regulations in your jurisdiction. And the first step in achieving success, other than getting that collaboration of partners together, is really define the target population you seek to impact. And our work over 20 years has allowed us to define it in this manner. Dual status means the overarching term to describe the population about whom we're speaking. Duly identified would represent those that were a part of that 67% in King County that are introduced into the youth justice system based on a new referral or complaint and have had a prior but not open history in the child welfare system, duly identified. Research is still there that implicates significant impact on the likely trajectory of that youth in the youth justice system as a duly identified youth. But it's even more impactful when they're duly involved. And that's the category where I said in King County, it was 29%. Their concurrent involvement. And of course, there's definitional language that needs to grind that out when we work with you, which we do. But duly involved is a much higher prevalence. In our work, we found that it can apply to as many as half of those involved in the youth justice system are actively involved in the child protection system. And then duly adjudicated are both a finding in the delinquency system and a finding in the dependency system. And that percentage is much smaller, but I hope I'm not shocking you when I say, on average, we find that that's around 15 to 18%. So that's 1 out of every 6 or 1 out of every 7 youth involved in the delinquency system may have been found dependent in the child welfare or child protection system. Given what we understand about the trajectory of these youth, that is a huge percentage, in my humble estimation, of the population that we need to focus targeted efforts or specialized attention to moving forward. This, once again, will be the lightning round portion that really gets you excited. It's about the infrastructure that needs to be built in a community in order to build a opportunity to impact these youth in a more positive way and both measure, sustain, and replicate moving forward, even through change of personnel. So while this is not the most glamorous slide, it speaks to our approach, which says we need a group of experts locally to develop as a subcommittee that can help us collect, manage, and identify prevalence, characteristics, and desired outcomes that we seek to impact for our target population. We need a group of experts locally that know about the resources, the current policies, the current practices affecting these youth independently in the dependency and the delinquency system, but also when they do cross and intersect. What do those policies and practices look like? And then, of course, we need a group of legal experts that will allow us to analyze the state statutes with regard to this population, existing regulations, and very importantly, the sharing of information, the sharing of data about these youth, which are often regulated by a lot of acronyms, which you all are familiar with. HIPAA, FERPA, CAPTA, all of those privacy regulations, both federal and state and local practice or local court rule that impacts whether or not and how we can work together to coordinate our efforts on behalf of this population. When we get the local expertise in these 3 subcommittees and they can do an analysis, it's facilitated when we're working in the jurisdiction, facilitated to get certain answers, certain information. We can report that to a leadership or an executive committee that can oversee this operation and be able to either authorize or support or enforce changes that we make recommendations for to more effectively impact this population of youth. So while the structure is certainly not very exciting to many, it's critical to the long-term success. We don't want to just be successful about the most crucial case. We want to be successful for each of these cases. And we've found that we can achieve that when we work together and rely on the unique expertise in the local state or local county or district jurisdiction. This is part of the responsibilities that we allocate in our process to those subcommittees that allow us to get all this information, to understand all the nuance of local practice, of local possibilities, local prohibitions, local restrictions, and local innovations is part of what really allows this process to achieve success. I don't know what kind of collaborative atmosphere you exist in your jurisdiction, but we would certainly emphasize that a group of leadership that represents judges, attorneys, both sides of the aisle, CASA, supportive advocacy for the youth and families, dependency system representation, delinquency system representation are the core personnel who need to make up this collaboration in order to conduct this kind of analysis and create innovative solutions on behalf of these youth. One more boring part, we're not just guessing about how we facilitate this process moving forward. We use science-based approaches. Believe it or not, this process mapping was an approach taken for businesses, but it allows us to identify key decision points where we can create innovative practice or build upon already strong cross-system practice. It does clarify for this population in a procedure, in a protocol, in a policy, the mandates, the responsibilities, the expectations of both products and outcomes at each key step that we develop in your jurisdiction. And obviously through this process mapping, we can identify not only why we can't do something, but with the optimism that we bring, and hopefully optimism that is inherent in that jurisdiction, we identify opportunities for process, practice, policy, statutory reforms that will result in better outcomes. Specifically, I hope we get to the place where you can see your role now. But this is a very simple process map that particular approach allows us to identify. And what we've identified here for you on these next two slides is the greatest opportunities for reforms and gains that produce the greatest likelihood of improved outcomes for this population. At the very referral process, and I won't bore you with examples at each, but in this particular instance, as the jump off point, the research is clear. These youth become duly involved, often as a result of their involvement in the child welfare, child protection system. The example I would give is we found significant prevalence of youth becoming duly involved because the foster parent filed a charge for assault within their foster home in order to alleviate the ongoing responsibility to work with that young person. I'm not challenging the credibility of the allegation, but I'm saying it's often circumstances that youth is in that they react to inappropriately, sometimes certainly with harm caused. But there are opportunities to re-examine whether or not the best course is formal prosecution or whether or not we can redouble our efforts to find another way to hold that youth accountable while not introducing them to the delinquency system, which is an immediate accelerant for their trajectory deeper into both the delinquency and dependency system. So it's an opportunity. And in fact, in Douglas County, Nebraska, when they embraced this from the prosecutorial position, over the next 3 years, and they did have it independently evaluated, they diverted 87% of their dual status youth at this key decision point. They didn't divert them to nothing. They diverted them to a methodology of intervention that considered a multidisciplinary analysis of what those needs were. And in fact, that evaluation with an 87% diversion rate also was accompanied by a 43% overall reduction in recidivism among that population with the diversion. So there's opportunities, and all we ask is careful consideration that this is a key opportunity to look at an alternative response. And that's the diversion piece that I'm speaking to. Third, if they are going to be formally petitioned or formally processed, it is important as early as possible in our research, in our practical findings, to convene a multidisciplinary team to bring together all the relevant and necessary information to identify, one, an initial crisis plan, so that we can alleviate what often happens with these youth is quick, rapid reoffending or loss of stability of their placement. So that multidisciplinary team can examine alternatives that might stabilize, that might undermine future risk, and get them, the youth and the family, on a path to service intervention that will provide that kind of stabilization and reduction of risk. So it's an extraordinary opportunity. Most of our jurisdictions develop this multidisciplinary team within 10 to 14 days of initial introduction of that case to them as a dual status youth in their target population. We have 2 jurisdictions that are working remarkably effective right now, one of which is focusing on removal from the home of a youth on a domestic violence charge, which is often making up 10 to 15% of these dual status youth populations. But they are operating that multidisciplinary team the next morning, and they've developed a respite care for that youth. So that youth is not going to detention. It gives them 14 days to work with the family and the youth to reconcile, provide that stability, and undermine future risk. So a multidisciplinary team is critically important in the examination of how we might improve practice. And then certainly through these collaborative case plans, we can offer at disposition a really comprehensive plan to address placement stability, to address reduction of risk, to address behavioral patterns, particularly around clinical behavioral health, but also education needs. A comprehensive dispositional recommendation that is coordinated by the multi-agencies to present to the court. These are reviewed by attorneys prior to making those recommendations. And often I would say, particularly with defense attorneys are attending our multidisciplinary teams to protect the interest and expressed interest of that youth, but also protecting against unauthorized sharing of information while still being an advocate for that youth and their expressed interests. So there's roles throughout this, all the way through disposition. And then the support of case management. There's several approaches to this. You can have a lead agency, make a determination collectively who will provide the primary oversight for the implementation of a case plan, or you can provide shared case management, which has often proved successful in many of our jurisdictions, where probation and juvenile justice come together. In fact, in Santa Clara, for 11 years now, Santa Clara County, California, they created a DIY unit that was co-located and also involved their behavioral health services unit to react and provide case management for their duly involved youth. So there's several ways to build this airplane as we fly into success. And the most successful way in North Carolina, in local jurisdictions or in local districts, is going to be dependent on the localized factors that the expertise of that collaboration brings together in the construct of policies and procedures. Just quickly, there are multiple methods of coordination, collaboration, cooperation. They are built upon that infrastructure that local jurisdictions develop to identify coordination across systems to identify those youth at the earliest possible point they become part of your target population. There is coordination to ensure that legally, with informed voluntary consents or authorizations, that we share relevant and necessary information to inform our next critical decision point. That we coordinate around, so I mentioned we're in San Diego and they have a comprehensive method of assessments and screening instruments for the juvenile justice system, but equally as comprehensive from their behavioral health services and from their education. So how do we share legally, properly, while protecting confidentiality privacy provisions of the youth and the family, the information that's relevant and necessary from those assessments to develop a joint assessment and ultimately a joint recommendation for treatment and intervention in a case plan that can be collaborative in its implementation. You will note, not just because I think I'm speaking to a number of attorneys and legal representatives, but because you're a critical player in developing the policies and procedures, We're not speaking about recklessly sharing information. We are speaking about being cognizant, being expert in an understanding of the Uninterrupted Scholars Act, the FERPA, the HIPAA, the CAPTA, the provisions that reflect the privacy and confidentiality provisions of youth and families in order to develop these policies and procedures. The attorneys play a key role in making sure that we're staying in the boundaries in so doing. Quick list of achieved outcomes. We use this to be able to identify in a local jurisdiction. So what that we now know about the characteristics of the population you want to impact here that are your dual status youth. What do we want to improve in terms of the outcomes? So the youth and family outcomes are distinguished by from the process outcomes, and both are critical to develop a method for evaluating in your jurisdiction this kind of initiative. We must develop policies, procedures, and protocols, and then we must adhere to them with fidelity if we're going to say with positive outcomes that what we constructed here is a cross-system methodology set of operations had an impact on our outcomes. Bottom line, evaluate the process to see if there's fidelity to it, and then argue whether or not it's providing the impact that we seek in identifying specific youth and family outcomes that we've achieved. The research that supports this list on the right of youth and family is that these youth often recidivate faster, more quickly, and more often. These youth lose placement, so the placement instability undermines so much of what they would have as a normal set of activities for a young person. And what we find in the research is reduced educational achievement, diminished involvement in pro-social or positive interactions or activities, mental health, substance use, not only about the youth, but the youth and the family, that which causes some instability in their home or in their placement. So these outcomes are informed by research, but we leave it as a list. Once locally you determine these are the characteristics of these youth and these families. So this is what we most want to impact, and build a set of operational policies and practices that impact those outcomes in your jurisdiction. All that led us to this place, folks. In January, this was published in the Juvenile Justice Update. My colleague and I wrote an article to try to capture a recent experience that piled on our historical experience out of an initiative in Ohio. Working currently with 4 jurisdictions, we're helping them to implement their policies and procedures. They've supported us for the past 4 years. And this article captures the process, the methodologies, the reformed policies, the adjustments to legal mandates and operations and court rules, and in fact, the creation of specific or specialized courts that have led to an enormous amount of success in 4 Ohio jurisdictions. I commend this article to you if you really wanted to understand how the process led to the identification of these 4 jurisdictions of what they were going to put into place, how they built a system of measurement, and how it's enabled them to sustain these practices. In fact, at this moment, Clark County, Ohio, which is one of our stars, Springfield, just outside of Columbus, is convening their executive committee meeting, which has met monthly for the last 4 years to continue to reassess and assess their progress or their fidelity to the original procedures and policies they developed. And in fact, today, they are acting on about 5 or 6 recommendations to minor changes to that policy and practice. Folks, that is the key to a long-term success approach. And we try to document that in this particular article. These are the 4 counties. You can see most of them are Western Ohio counties. Quite honestly, most of them are regarded as semi-rural, although Springfield is 175,000 folks. 80 counties in Ohio are characterized the way in which the 4 that we're working with are. The other 8 are the large urban jurisdictions, and our success has come from these suburban rural jurisdictions that are identified here: Hancock, Champaign, Clark, and Fairfield. Out of this, folks, and maybe you just wanted me to cut to this right to the beginning. But there's 7 core practices that we have found over the last 2 decades that are critical to be in place. And I think they further instruct any local jurisdiction taking on this work in North Carolina to move forward. And it's around routine, regular early identification. We actually establish a standard and ask that any process that they develop will capture 95% of the target population. The agreement on the sought set of outcomes. Why so? One, the activities, the policies, the practices that we develop are then designed to achieve those outcomes. And there's very clear science on what it is that most impacts behavioral health improvement, behavioral health functioning, or educational improvement, or family stability or placement stability. So by identifying these sought set of outcomes, we collaboratively develop a procedure and a policy and operations that are intended to impact those outcomes. So agreeing on those. And you might guess, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I have my outcomes. My mandate is expressed interest of the child. And prosecution, my outcome is accountability of that youth. Part of this collaboration is how can we translate those mandates into a shared set of outcomes? So it's a challenge, but success has been achieved remarkably in Ohio. You heard me mention earlier the validated screening and assessment instruments. We know in North Carolina, the youth justice system is committed to the YASI. That would be one piece. We know that many of these youth have an IEP in education. That would be a second piece of this coordination of validated screening and assessment instruments to help support collaborative decision-making around services, treatments, and appropriate interventions. You heard me emphasize the alternatives to formal processing. As a prosecutor, we hope the recognition can be that there's a balance between protecting community safety, holding that youth accountable, and still achieving positive outcomes for dual status youth through alternative measures that are designed to reduce the risk, reduce the recidivism, achieve a positive change in behavior, and stabilize that young person in that family situation. Engagement of family is not just that we chatted to them, but we worked with them at every stage of the key decision points. And that's a meaningful engagement. And in fact, in our work in Western Carolina with District 25 right now, we're going to be supporting some best practices about how to enhance the engagement of families and caregivers on behalf of the entire youth population and youth justice system. You heard me mention the multidisciplinary team process. In our findings and our evaluation, it's critical to put this into the operational procedures and protocols. And then a true coordination of case planning, of court process, and then case management. It takes on many different forms locally, but in our partnership, we've got examples of successful case plans that stabilize, court process that acts efficiently, that acts expediently, that acts effectively, and then case management that demonstrates that type of really community coordination around that youth and the family to achieve the outcomes that you have identified to be sought. Folks, you're going to have the PowerPoint presentation. There's 2 slides of these. Markers of development, that multi-system leadership collaboration. We have developed a methodology and evaluation assessment of dual status youth projects, and we can administer that in your jurisdiction to help identify how are you doing on the collaboration. There's multiple practical elements of the collaboration that demonstrate the success of that collaboration moving forward. So these 8 markers we identify, and there's several levels of detail below this that help guide, instruct where your strengths are in a local jurisdiction and where we need to bolster this particular set of activities that is a clear marker of the success that's been achieved, not only in these 4 jurisdictions in Ohio, but across many of those that we identified in that earlier map. I'll focus on number 4 before just giving you a brief glimpse of the final slide, but a frequent challenge, and it's challenged by legal statutes, legal strictures, but cross-system data collection is often a challenge. MOUs, agreements that need to be structured in some jurisdictions can be difficult to achieve. What we're trying to do in these data collection is make sure that there's nothing that's personally identifiable in the methodologies that we create, but we can collect aggregate data that allows us to sustain our initiative on behalf of this population. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to report that. We're actually going to be publishing later this year a data collection protocol manual that has emerged from our Ohio work that really is a step-by-step methodology for the kinds of important data that needs to be collected, then managed, and then routinely reported to that leadership collaboration so that that group can assess, are we achieving success? Do we need to make amendments? Whatever we do based on our anecdotal, our experience, and our data. So those are key markers. And then here, I think I've made my point on some of the others. We have to overcome legal impediments. Despite the granular nature of what we propose, the development of specific language, and you can imagine how we might parse language in a detailed policy and procedure and protocol. But the MDT also, we have found, requires early convening of the MDT and expert facilitation. In multiple jurisdictions in Ohio, they trained a facilitator for this role as a part of their action steps. And then the training to all of the parties, to the attorneys, to the judges, to our community providers, and certainly to the social workers and probation staff that are tasked with working with these youth out of case management. These are important markers, and if we know these in advance, we can design our policies and procedures in any North Carolina jurisdiction to succeed and achieve the possible on behalf of dual status youth. I never once looked down at my clock, so I have no idea how long it took, Michelle, but I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in any discussion that we might have. I just looked at it, and it looks like we may have 10 or 15 minutes left if anyone wants to ask questions or make some observations and share their perspectives.
We do have about 15 minutes, John. I did want to ask you, how do you come to be involved with the communities who want to do this? And I think you said you are involved in one district in North Carolina. Is that correct?
We are. It's District 25, which is, I think, getting renamed as District something else, reorganized. But they've told us to just keep calling it District 25. So it's Catawba, it's Burke, and it's Caldwell counties. That particular initiative, Michelle, has come out of a State Justice Institute grant where we selected 3 jurisdictions across the country who wanted to undertake a comprehensive probation and youth justice system review. That's targeted on the entire youth justice population. This initiative is targeted on dual status youth. They became involved because they indicated an interest, and we included them when we were awarded the grant. I have a call on Friday with the director of a particular county in Union County in Ohio that is interested in this work. So it's an initial conversation that explores. So what does your collaboration look like? What does the environment look like? We're just talking practical, Michelle, to get a conversation started. I might ask some more pointed questions. As you can tell, we get into the weeds in our support. But ultimately, if there's a sense that there's some optimism, some opportunity, and we want to support it. The more we can highlight the jurisdictions everywhere that this can be done, and here's another new innovative approach, then we highlight that. So it can be as simple, Michelle, as reaching out and beginning those discussions. You might guess with our experience, we are not a foundation. We don't have ready-made funds. In essence, the contracts that we have are fee-based or grant-based. But we might have some familiarity with grant sources when we have those conversations. If those sources of funding to provide to help support our 1 year, 12-month of intensive technical assistance support, we regard ourselves as partners. This is not from afar. It is today, but it's not from afar. And if we initiate a conversation, start to explore how this could be done, how we could be contracted to provide that, then I may say it too boldly, but we find a way. Because if there's interest and motivation to impact this population, my personal motivation continues to drive me to advance opportunities on behalf of this target population. So, Michelle, as simple as a conversation.
If a district is interested and it becomes reality, how long does it usually take to get everything placed for this actually to go into practice?
from initial conversation, if the funding is there, if the district indicates they want to go forward. I mean, there's an honest conversation, Michelle, because we're back and forth a little bit about the collaboration, the partnership, some of the startup points of being able to at least process the notion that we would, that local jurisdiction would develop a collaboration of work. Look, we've been in a jurisdiction less than a month from initial contact. And again, I should emphasize, it's a 12-month process. We're not in and out. We're not looking to drop a model. Here's your policies, here's your procedures, here's your protocol. Go put it in place. We are active partners in the resolution of all the legal, of all the data, of all the collaboration, of all the policy and the procedure issues. And because of our experience, we bring a lot of examples that might satisfy the innovative nature of that local jurisdiction in taking this on. But we're working with you. The TA workbook that I identified in an earlier slide details every activity, every engagement, every sense of the timeline over an 8 to 10 month period that we're partnering with you to get to the finish line of developing operational policies and procedures to achieve success for dual status youth.
Yes, it looked like it's also very dependent on the local resources in doing this.
It is in Ohio, it was the Ohio Supreme Court. Their Children and Family Services Division provided a grant. In many jurisdictions, Michelle, it's court improvement project funds. In multiple other jurisdictions, my background at OJJDP allows me to know about the Title II formula grant funds and the JJDP Act's commitment to this population, which we had a little bit of say in 2017 in getting that language into the JJDP Act. So there's multiple funding sources that don't only rely on localities. They may rely on the state. They may rely on other agencies in that state. What we want to do is help source the funding for that opportunity.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask Mr. Toole? I don't think we do. One thing that I did want to ask you, you have such wide and varied experience in this area. Just, I guess, on a more personal level, what are your recommendations if you have for helping these children not become dual status youth?
Early intervention, early attention to the first identification that they have experience in both systems. Obviously, ours focuses on the introduction into the youth justice system and the recognition that there's the prior history. There are both pathways in both directions, but the research would suggest that 85% of that pathway of dual involvement comes from entering into the youth justice system with a background of dependency involvement. So early intervention. Within our approach, we intervene as early as we can, but with recognition in a community that these characteristics emerge often at first entry into elementary school. The sooner we interrupt and attend to the trauma, the instability, and the behavioral pattern that youth is expressing, the better off we are. So even beyond our initiative and where we focus, sometimes we've had 7 or 8 years of evidence before they first become involved as a youth that defined as dual status in the jurisdictions in which we work. That's a lot to overcome, Michelle.
Yes.
So I say the collaboration at a local level, and the schools are often a significant part of that recognition. Then they've got to have an approach that says, so how do we collaborate on getting the necessary information, understanding the home environment, as well as the student's behavioral pattern, and create plans to help stabilize the economic conditions, perhaps the substance use or mental health concerns within that family. That's my personal note, because we're professionals. We know when we see it. Unfortunately, I don't want to end with necessarily some gotcha thing, but our partnership to create some of these data agreements is with the National Center for juvenile justice. I've known my most prominent colleagues, the current director, Hunter Hurst, and probably the foremost researcher around this issue, Gene Siegel, for 25, 30 years. Gene and I have been involved where I'm aware of most every school shooter that you can identify was a dual status youth. And again, not fear mongering in this statement, but it just reinforces that the pattern for these youth can become so destructive, either self-destructive or destructive to their community. We can do better. We can intervene earlier, both as a community response and then where we are able to focus at the point at which they're identified in the local jurisdiction as needing and requiring this cross-system collaboration. Our point of intervention is necessitated or facilitated by the fact that it's almost okay, we got you. Both systems are required to respond because there's involvement in both. So how are we going to collaborate to do that effectively? We could go farther upstream and do so much more for so many of these youth if we're reacting to these obvious behaviors and challenges and vulnerabilities at an earlier age. That's what I'd hope for every community, to recognize that the trajectory can be really tragic. And the tragedy that I spoke about, one hung himself in detention at age 17, one shot himself at age 15, and one youth that I had worked with for 5 years, who I stayed in touch with. I learned from her sister that she took her own life when she was 26. These outcomes can be avoided. So you unfortunately gave me an opportunity to show my real passion. I gave you the details. My passion is we have to make a difference for these youth because it's a tough trajectory to overcome.
Yes, it certainly is. And we appreciate all you've done and your work in this field and presenting this information to us today. Hopefully this will inspire more communities to do something like this. And I especially will be interested in your involvement in North Carolina and how that goes. And it would be great if some more communities could get involved.
Michelle, just to close, I invite the conversation. It doesn't have to result in a contract. It can be advice. We're a National Resource Center. We have many calls that are just discussions about how you might want to proceed. I'd love to engage in what is now my home state with anybody who might be inspired or have a passion to do something more effectively in their jurisdiction. You will find I'm not just talking to you so we can get a contract. We're busy. I want to talk to you about any way that I might help a committed set of professionals to impact these kids and their families. So now that it is my home state, I would love to be supportive of anybody who's interested in moving something forward.
Yes, in case, I don't know if everyone caught that, but Mr. Toole, he does live in North Carolina now. So he is local to all of us, I guess you could say. And and also we have recorded this presentation and we're going to provide a link to everyone for those who couldn't make it today. So hopefully beyond those who attended today, that you will get more exposure and hopefully more interest in becoming involved in these initiatives for dual status youth. So again, thank you for your presentation today. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be speaking to you again.
I hope so. Michelle, Brianne, thank you for everyone who took the time today. I really appreciate it. Look forward to hearing from you.